So, good evening to the people sitting in the India and good morning to the people sitting in the United States. Very good morning, ma'am. Professor Audrey Truschke is a distinguished historian and a scholar of South Asia with a specialization in the cultural, religious, and intellectual interactions between Indo-Islamic and Sanskrit traditions during the early modern period. She currently holds the position of Professor of History at Rutgers University, Nevada, a role she has held since 2020. Doctor Trushke's academic journey began with a Bachelor of Arts in Religious Studies from the University of Chicago, 2004, where she graduated with general honors. She went on to pursue her postgraduate studies at Columbia University, earning an MA in 2007, MPhil in 2008, and ultimately a PhD in 2012 in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African studies with distinction. Her academic formation was further enhanced by prestigious fellowships such as the Fulbright Hays Doctoral Dissertation Research Abroad Fellowship, the Mellon ACLS Dissertation Completion Fellowship, and the Visiting Fellowship at the University of Paris. Dr. Trushke's research bridges multiple linguistic, cultural, and religious domains, particularly focusing on Sanskrit and Persian textual traditions, Mughal imperial ideology, and the historiography of Indo-Muslim encounters. Her scholarly output is marked by a deep commitment to analyzing cross-cultural translations and representation within the intellectual frameworks of early modern South Asia. Her publications include Cultural of Encounters, Sanskrit at the Mughal Court, published in 2016, Aurangzeb, The Life and the Legacy of India's Most Controversial King, published in 2017, The Language of History, Sanskrit Narratives of Indo-Muslim Rule, published in 2021, and her upcoming book, India, 5,000 Years of History on the Subcontinent. Many congratulations to you for your upcoming book. Ma'am has also contributed to numerous edited volumes and journals, including Comparative Studies of South Asia and the Middle East, Philological Encounters, and History of Religions, among others. Dr. Trushke is an active public intellectual and an outspoken critique of Hindutva ideology. Her essays and op-eds in the Wire, the Caravan, Aeon, and the Scroll addresses pressing concerns such as religious nationalism, historical revisionism, and freedom of academic inquiry in India. She is the founding member of South Asia Scholar Activist Collective and a contributor to the Hindutva Harassment Field Manual, aimed at supporting scholars targeted by ideological harassment. She has delivered dozens of invited lectures around the globe, including at Princeton University, University of Washington, University of Texas Austin, and others. Dr. Trushke's work has been supported by numerous grants and fellowships, including the NEH Public Scholarship 2021, Global Equity Grant from Princeton University Press 2020, and visiting professorships at IEHESS in 2019. She has been board member at New Jersey Council for Humanities, advisory board member, Journal of South Asian Intellectual History, and the list goes on. Ma'am is known for her philological rigor and command of multiple languages, including Sanskrit and Persian, Hindi, Urdu, and Braj Bhasha. Her training enables her to work directly with original sources. That's very important. Across traditions, making her work especially valuable in revisiting the shared and contested histories of India's pre-modern past. Thank you so much, ma'am, for accepting our invitation. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Aditya, for that very kind introduction. A warm welcome to everyone. Good evening and good morning, depending on where you are. Let me get my PowerPoint set up, because images are more fun than staring at me. Let's see. All right. You guys can see my screen, right? Yeah, I did too. All right. All right, so I am here today to talk about my book, India, 5,000 Years of History on the Subcontinent. Okay, the book releases in about 2 weeks in the United States, in about 4 weeks in India. Sorry, we're just a tad behind on the printing there. That's the only reason for the slight delay. And I thought, by way of introduction, I might share with you all the story of how I came to write such a book. All right? It was not my idea. All right. I was originally contacted by Princeton University Press by an editor there who suggested that I write a big book. And that's how she framed it, at least in my memory, as a big book about India. And of course, I asked, well, like, what part? Like, do we have a geographic focus, a temporal focus? And she was like, no, the whole thing. So I said I would think about it, and I did. But honestly, I didn't have to think that hard before I said no. And I originally said no to writing the book because I felt that it was frankly insane. Trying to cover the entirety of known human history in India or South Asia, I'll get to the multiple terms shortly. This is a little bit like trying to write the history of all of Europe and Africa, like all of it, okay? People don't do that because it doesn't actually work. My PowerPoint went away. I think you took me away as host. All right. Anyways, okay. So I said no. All right. But obviously I was persuaded. And what happened was I met with this editor at Princeton University Press. I explained my reasons, and she was like, "Look, I get it, but we're gonna get someone to write this book. Like, we asked you first, but we will ask somebody else if we have to." And she also pointed out, don't you need something to teach? And I was like, well, I do. Because, of course, I teach nearly 5,000 years of history of South Asia over 2 semesters annually at Rutgers Newark. I don't teach that class because I think it's a great way to approach South Asian history. I think it's too big and too broad, but it's the way we do it in the United States, right? And so I had originally been asking the question, should we approach Indian or South Asian history in this manner, right? As something that can fit into a single volume. The answer to that question is no. I don't think that's a great idea. But instead, I started asking the question, well, if we're going to do it, what's the best way, right? Within the framework of this is how it's going to be done. And so it's sort of a practical accommodation. But in the end, I actually have a lot of views and a lot of experience in terms of thinking about the kind of longue durée of Indian or South Asian history. As I said, I teach this. I have for about a decade at Rutgers Newark. I'm also trained in multiple periods of South Asian history. I started my career as a Sanskritist working on ancient and early India. My dissertation work was on the medieval or early modern period, kind of, mid to late second millennium. And then in recent years, I've done quite a bit of work on modern South Asia as well. So I have the training, and in the end, I had the will to write the book. All right? So we inked the contract for India in September of 2020. I promised to write a 215,000 word manuscript. That's about double the length of a normal scholarly monograph. In exchange, Princeton University Press agreed to publish it, assuming that it passed peer review, which it did. Immediately, we had name problems, which is why India is in scare quotes here. As everyone in the Zoom room knows, there are a lot of names for what we now call South Asia or parts thereof. All right? South Asia, broadly speaking, comprises 8 modern nation states: India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, the Maldives, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, and Nepal. I know I was missing one. All right. In the contract, we called the book South Asia. I think we like History of South Asia, relatively straightforward name. As I worked on the book, which took several years, I called it India. And of course, there are lots of other names for either the subcontinent or regions thereof: Jambudvipa, Hindustan, Bharat, Bharatavarsha, so on and so forth. But in the end, the big choice that I faced was whether we titled the book India or South Asia and what term or phrase I used throughout. And in the end, I didn't choose. I used both throughout the book. And that's because India and South Asia both have benefits and drawbacks. South Asia is the broader term, okay? It's more inclusive and includes a broader landmass. It also is pretty useful for shaking people out of nationalist boundaries, which is a modern issue that for some people can color their entire interpretation of the South Asian past. That's all great, but South Asia is also a pretty new term. Okay, it's a 20th century term. And outside of South Asia, it is widely confused with Southeast Asia. Okay, that confusion is common and persistent outside of the region. In contrast, India, now that is a legible term. People have some sense of India, of what it is. Some people even where it is. All right, probably not all Americans, but hopefully most. Of course, the big drawback of the word India is that for most people, that really means the post-1947 nation state. Whereas throughout the majority of my book, until the last couple of chapters, I use India in its pre-modern historical sense of the Indian subcontinent. That's the landmass that is now occupied by India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and parts of Afghanistan as well. Now, some of what I've said, I imagine some of you may disagree with. Maybe strongly, maybe lightly, maybe you have some quibbles with how I'm kind of thinking about these terms. Maybe you think I should have titled the book South Asia rather than India. And I'm here to tell you, my friends, that this is just the beginning of things you are going to disagree with me about regarding this book, because this is just the first of a series of challenges that I faced and decisions that in the end, I couldn't title it both. I had to come down on one or the other. So what I want to do today with the remainder of my time with you all, I want to do three basic things. I'm going to give you a real brief overview of the book. That'll take 5 minutes or less. I want to spend most of my time elaborating the kind of guiding features, key principles that I implemented when writing the book. I'll do that using examples drawn from the book, so it'll give you some of the broad stuff and some of the delightful details as well. And then I'll close with some brief reflections on the state of Indian or South Asian history. So the book is divided into 24 chapters. This is the table of contents right here. I move forward chronologically throughout time. No big surprise there. Any historian would do that. I want to acknowledge that the pull of the present is very real. Okay, and this is a problem because it's not good historical practice to give more attention to the present than the past, but it is almost unavoidable. I do cover shorter periods of time as I move forward in the book. So consider that chapter 1 on the Indus Valley civilization, that covers between 700 and 900 years. 700 years in the title, but really I do about 900 years in there. Compare that to chapter 23 on new nation states, where I cover less than 50 years of history. While I too am a person in the 21st century and I did not fully avoid the pull of presentism, that said, a full 2/3 of this book is on pre-modernity. Okay, chapters 1 through 16 cover events before around 1750, before British colonialism. Within that, a full 1/3 of the book is on early India, ancient India, and then the next 1/3 is about the medieval or early modern periods. There's a practical element at play there. Among other audiences, I did have undergraduate students in mind when writing this book, and that sort of breakdown works well for both semester and quarter systems. But more than that, more important to me is the conceptual point that the vast majority of South Asian history or Indian history is pre-modern. And so I consciously rejected the approach taken by many historians of cramming pre-modern, ancient, medieval, early modern, cramming all of that into like 3 chapters, and then spending like 20 chapters on the British. Okay, I think that is a poor way to approach an overview of South Asian history, and so I do it different. I spend a lot of time in pre-modernity, and I want readers to know that those parts of South Asian history, not only do they matter, but they're the centerpiece. Most of this is pre-modern. Turning to the contents beyond an overview, the real question is, how do I do it, right? How do I construct what I view as an accurate, evidence-based, and nuanced narrative of Indian history? So going through some of my guiding principles. The first is that to the extent possible, I try to allow the people of the South Asian past to speak for themselves. I quote throughout the book from a great many primary sources, all in translation, some of which I translated myself and some of which I did not. All right. In addition to that, I also have boxed primary source texts. Okay, they're literally in boxes set apart from the main text. There's 1 to 2 per chapter. These are primary sources from the period in question, given as per each chapter's focus. Now, among these boxed primary source texts, we have, I don't know, maybe 30 to 40 in the book. I should have counted them, but I didn't. All right. There's some old goodies, some things that, and some texts that any historian would have included. These include excerpts from the Vedic hymns, excerpts from the Upanishads. You can see one on the screen here, the delightful story of Satyakama and his mother Jabala. I give excerpts from the Ashokan edicts, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Kama Sutra. That's all in early India. Later on, I give Bande Mataram, and I also give excerpts from Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste, among many other works. In addition, I also include some less likely candidates, some texts that not every historian would include or necessarily even knows about. These include a Sanskrit Jain work on the Khalji conquests of the 14th century, when Alauddin Khalji sort of sweeps down into central and southern India. I give excerpts from Vishnu Sena's charter. This was a law code that was actually used in a merchant community in 592 CE. I give excerpts from a circa 1700 Telugu drama about a Brahmin who lusts after a Dalit woman to the consternation of literally everyone around them. Okay, you see excerpts of that one on the screen here. And a bit later, I give excerpts from Savitri Phule's poetry, prizing education for lower caste communities. My goal is to allow not only pre-modern South Asians and later periods of South Asians as well to speak for themselves, but to allow a variety of South Asians to speak to the reader. And that variety, that is something I want to emphasize. Because in the book, I present a greater diversity of voices than we often hear in South Asian history. This is diversity according to gender, caste, class, region, language, and religion. What does that actually mean? All right, and I ask that question because this is a concrete book. This is not a book of theory or, it's not like thoughts on Indian history. Like, this is a book about real people and real events. It is very much a concrete work. And so what does that kind of diversity actually look like? So we have to think about the social hierarchies that have tended to structure South Asian societies over time. And given those hierarchies, what this means is that readers hear from more women, Dalits, lower castes, poor and disadvantaged communities, South Indians, non-Indian South Asians, non-Sanskrit speakers, and non-Hindus. Now, why does that matter? We talk a lot about diversity these days. Okay, at least I feel like I talk a lot about diversity these days. It's a modern buzzword, okay? We all like diversity, and that's great. But I feel like sometimes we actually fail to articulate why diversity is important, okay? And I want to do that. To me, diverse voices from the South Asian past help us pursue two pretty distinct goals. The first is that it gives us access to more stories and forgotten narratives. Usually these are from disempowered communities historically, such as tribal people. All right, you can read book after book of South Asian history in terms of overviews and never hear about tribal people. But I talk about them repeatedly. For example, they were exempted from Ashoka's commitment to nonviolence in the 3rd century BCE. All right, Ashoka promised not to hurt anybody after the battle at Kalinga, except the forest people. And then the forest people were subject to displacement recurrently by the Guptas, the Mughals, even the Indian National Congress Party. Those three occurring at very different points in South Asian history. A second thing that incorporating diverse voices helps us to do is to better understand more dominant groups. And I'll give you the example of Manu. Okay, Manu was a law theorist, early 1st millennium CE. He has incredibly harsh things to say about lower castes. In the book, I try in that section to communicate what Manu's ideals were, right? Which is sort of his prizing of inequality and what that would have meant in his world. And I can best do that if I do two things. If I allow Manu to speak for himself, which I do, I quote him several times, and if I bring in the perspective of the communities that were harmed by his ideas. And I do that as well. Now, speaking of Manu, okay, Manu wrote his Manu Smriti, or also called the Manava Dharma Shastra, in the north. And that's great, okay? But here's the thing. We have some regional problems in South Asian history, in that we tend to emphasize some regions more than others. Okay, very few people talk about the Northeast all that much, and many historians emphasize North India over South India. I'm no exception in my other work. Okay, my work very much focuses on North India. But there are reasons beyond the foci of individual scholars for why our overview histories of India tend to privilege the North, right? Especially sort of like the Gangetic heartland. All right? For example, two of our big early moments in South Asian history are entirely confined to North India. All right, both of these to the northwest. This would be the Indus Valley civilization. You see images of their material culture on the screen, right? And then later and separate would be early Vedic society with the Vedic or Indo-European or Aryan migrations. That those two events were confined to the northwest, largely what's now Pakistan, bits of Afghanistan as well for the Vedic folks. That is a fact of history. We can't change that. But what we can do is bring in evidence that's less discussed from elsewhere on the subcontinent. I'll give you the example of the ash mounds of central and southern India. Okay, I bring these in the same chapter where I cover the Indus Valley civilization, although they are completely separate. These are from a different group of people entirely. They were created in southern India between 2700 and 1200 BCE, roughly contemporaneous with the Indus Valley civilization. We know how people made them. They burned cow dung, a lot of cow dung, repeatedly at the same area over centuries. So this wasn't just like cleaning up. This wasn't incidental, okay? Often the ash mounds were in the center of human habitation areas, and the fires were really hot. They got up to 1200 degrees Celsius, and so created this kind of calcified rock that grew over time, creating monumental structures that could be seen from miles around in the landscape. You can see one on the screen. These things are still visible today in southern India, right? In this case, interrupting farmland. The largest ash mound is 10 meters high by 130 meters across. Now, we don't have any writing from these folks, so we don't know a lot more about them, but we can at least bring in the material evidence we have to talk about what people were doing in other parts of the subcontinent. Moving forward in the book, I repeat this tactic of bringing in material evidence to geographically diversify our gaze. even after we have written sources. For example, I reconstruct parts of the history of early Buddhism in the first few centuries there through material evidence in Sri Lanka, rather than relying solely on written Buddhist sources from northern India. So in brief, diverse evidence helps us see a more complete picture. But I'm talking about disparate things, disparate civilizations, different events. And so the question arises of what's the thread that runs throughout Indian history? Right? What ties it all together? The answer is that there isn't a single thread. Okay, South Asian or Indian history is more like a collection of not fully cohering stories. But that's really narratively challenging. All right, it's narratively challenging to work with. And so as a result, many historians have turned to political dynasties, okay, as a way to anchor South Asian history and to give a chronology. All right, sort of organizing periods of Indian history by rulers. This is problematic for a host of reasons, including that it's elite, it's usually North India centric, all right? And often it's pedantic detail without understanding. It also misses the bulk of Indian history. Right? History is how people lived and how they changed the world around them. That includes politics, but it equally includes religious history, social history, and material culture. We must balance all of those and more with hard political history if we are to survey the history of India rather than the far more narrow political history of India. And my book is an overview history, not an overview political history. What this means is that I talk less about dynasties than a lot of other historians. Don't get me wrong. Plenty of dynasties occur in the pages of my book, including, I think, almost every name on this screen right now, okay? But just because we're talking about, say, the Guptas, doesn't mean we always have to talk about the Guptas. All right, let me explain. The Guptas are a good example because my decision on what to focus on within them was made easier in that we actually have pretty limited evidence about the Gupta kings. All right, we're not even sure of the exact regnal years of many of their major rulers, like Samudragupta. If that doesn't sound like what you learned, that's because many scholars have extrapolated immense amounts of detail and so what they view as hard history from very meager evidence. I'm very uncomfortable with that work. I think it has an extremely precarious foundation. And so instead, when I talk about the Guptas, I talk about the one thing we actually know a lot about from them, which is their political propaganda, their state propaganda, and how they wanted to be seen as Vaishnava rulers. They're one of the early dynasties to adopt that sort of identity. And so, for example, I talk about this in the context of this image of Vishnu's Varaha, his boar incarnation that rises out of the ocean. Okay? This is on a cave wall at Udayagiri. The Guptas paid for this. Now, I think it's pretty cool to look at even today. But imagine at the time that the floor was covered with water. All right, that's how it was designed. So the Vishnu's boar incarnation looks like he's rising from the ocean's depths. We also know about a bunch of other important stuff that was happening in the mid-first millennium CE in northern and central India. Okay? This is around the time the Guptas are ruling a small part of northern India. Okay, their territory is also more circumscribed than many imagine. So instead of talking about, our tentative lists of Gupta kings, I focus on broader trends. This includes declining standards of life for many women, as practices like shunning Hindu widows came into existence. We see our first sati stones from around this time. I've got one on the screen. We also see huge consequential shifts in Hindu practices. This includes the rise of temple-based and icon-centered worship. Neither of those things were part of Vedic society. It also includes seeing fairly new gods sort of surging in popularity, like Shiva, a non-Vedic deity. And you see one of our earliest lingams or lingas representing him here. I cover all of that and more, which I have time and space to do in a chapter of about 6,000 words, because I don't center the Gupta lineage alone. And I make this case to readers over and over. Consider what reducing our emphasis on politics, what talking less about the few in power allows us to glimpse about people on the ground. All right? This includes carnelian bead fashion. All right, you can see some carnelian beads on the screen here with the white designs etched into them. This is something that began in the Indus Valley civilization and continues in later periods of South Asian history. That's very unusual. We have very few things we can clearly trace from the Indus civilization until later. But what people like to wear around their neck, that's one thing we can trace. I talk later about Panchatantra stories, animal fables that demonstrate moralistic ideas. These are composed across India and they spread like wildfire across Southeast Asia, the Middle East, eventually reaching Europe. In the end, Panchatantra stories are one of pre-modern India's most popular cultural exports. I talk about art and poetry at Sigiriya in Sri Lanka in the first millennium. You can see a very lovely image of two women painted here. Thousands of people traveled in the late first millennium CE to see this image and others, and then inscribed poetry about these images on the walls. At Sigiriya, it was sort of a pre-modern tourist hotspot. I talk about the birth of modern Benares in the 1700s, as Brahmins, especially the Peshwa Maratha rulers, remade the city into a lucrative Hindu pilgrimage hub, as it remains today. Many people think that goes back much further in time than it actually does. When we get to our times we've all lived through in the 21st century, I talk about some of the politics, but I also talk about art. I talk about high art, like paintings. I talk about film art, like Bollywood. I also talk about truck art, popular in northern India and Pakistan. Now, much of what I just mentioned probably sounds good, at least to a lot of you, right? I mean, who doesn't like a nice necklace with carnelian beads? But history is not all roses. I cover a lot of difficult subjects in these pages, including slavery and bonded labor throughout South Asian history. I talk about extreme discrimination by caste and gender at different points. I cover famines, especially in British India, a recurrent problem tied to the colonial model of exploitation. And of course, I talk about numerous individual traumatic events, such as partition. Some of these things have connections with politics, of course. But there is a difference between narrating the political back and forth that led into partition versus talking about the human suffering of the event and what it was like for many people to live through. In the case of partition, I tell both of those stories in fairly equal measure. Now we have more than, I think, around 50 images in the book, as well as 24 maps, okay? One for each chapter. I do caution folks who will buy the book in India, okay, that there are slightly fewer maps in the version that we are selling in India. That is owing to the modern nation state of India's anti-free speech laws and their extreme sensitivity regarding accurately demarcating the borders in Kashmir. So we had to take out a couple of the maps. But for everyone else, there's 24, and Indian readers get most of the maps, all the earlier ones. I didn't make the maps. I had a wonderful map maker. All right. But I was very involved in making them. And I used the maps to drive home some key points. Take a look, for example, at this map. This is Ashoka's Mauryan Empire, 3rd century BCE. It probably looks a little different than other maps of Ashoka that you have seen before. All right, among other things, because it looks a little bit like Swiss cheese, right? It's got a bunch of holes in it. This is more accurate, I think, to demonstrating Ashoka's actual level of control across his empire. Okay, it's not perfect, but I think it goes a little ways towards correcting this bad idea that Ashoka somehow controlled all this territory in equal measure. Actually, there were large parts of the subcontinent that he probably had no political control over, all right? Largely because of geographical features like deserts, mountainous areas, and tribal areas. Here's another example. All right, this map looks a little different. All right, this is around 1050 CE. And if you haven't figured it out yet, south is up. Okay, we flipped it. We flipped the map. This is showing you the Chola kingdom or empire, all right, along with Tamil trader networks. The idea of flipping the map, right? It's a very heavy-handed way of driving home the point that sometimes we should center southern India, not northern India, right? Change our perspective. Also, it's important that I distinguish between territory that the Cholas controlled, which was parts of peninsular India and then the northern part of Sri Lanka, versus areas across the coasts of parts of the subcontinent and Southeast Asia where Tamil traders have influence. Sometimes that's all shown as the Chola Empire, and that is incorrect. Okay, it mistakes the nature of Indian influence in those regions. It also misattributes what traders did to the Chola state. Okay, Tamil trader networks survived the demise of the Cholas. Last map example I'll give. Okay, we're back to the normal way we think of things, with north being up. This is showing you peninsular India in the long 15th century. So 1400s plus a little bit on either end. All right, you've got the Bahmani kingdom, the Vijayanagara kingdom. I've also got the Gajapati kingdom. You'll notice not a lot's going on in northern India. Okay, I marked where Delhi is. All right. But otherwise, northern India is sort of blank, and that is to center the reader's attention on central and southern India. And the bulk of this chapter focuses on what's going on down there, especially similarities between the Bahmani and Vijayanagara rulers and their kingdoms. All right. Their two lineages intermarried. They had similar kind of land control stuff going on. They even both wanted to be known as sultans, despite the Vijayanagara rulers being Hindu, all right? And then you'll notice that there's quite a bit going on over in Persia and Khorasan, all right? And that comes out in the chapter when I talk about the Bahmani's kingdom's sea-based links with both Persia and Khorasan, all right? This is one of many points where I go a bit beyond South Asia to recover South Asian history. Okay, India's never cut off from the rest of the world, so you do have to look beyond the subcontinent or South Asia, generally speaking, at times, right? It also helps me to drive home the point that, again, I make in the book, that if we think about like India altogether, we don't see any of this. Right? Because links between northern and southern India were at like a low in this period because of issues with the Tugluks. They were sort of forced to retreat back up north. All right, so we don't want to think of India as one cohesive entity. Rather, we want to focus on what's going on discretely in different parts of the subcontinent. Now, I won't spoil too many of the images from the book, all right? But I give a number of nice images, including this one. And I'm showing it to you now to make the fairly basic point that I do correct a lot of persistent misperceptions and misinterpretations in South Asian history. This is a Yakshi, okay, who was found in Pompeii. So she was made in central India, shipped over to the Roman Empire in sea-based trade sometime before 79 CE. That's when Mount Vesuvius erupted and Pompeii was covered in ash. She was found there in the 20th century during excavations. All right. This Yakshi has been mistaken as Lakshmi, the Hindu goddess, and was for decades. All right. I present her properly as a Yakshi, following more recent scholarly interpretations. Now, in a sense, this decision to correct misinterpretations in the past, this was an easy one as a historian, right? You got to go with the evidence. But it also corrects some stuff that people still cling to today. And so I knew writing the book that it would upset some people. There's a lot of pressure right now on historians of South Asia to honor the feelings of the living. Okay, some say we should even whitewash the past so as not to offend modern sentiments. That pressure, broadly speaking, comes from far-right corners, and I staunchly reject it. I refuse to bow to it. Instead, I seek to honor the dead. I want to honor prior generations of Indians and South Asians by telling their stories in a truthful and unvarnished fashion. And so, in the part of the book on the 19th century, I talk about coolies, indentured servants who left India by the millions in the 19th century as our first large-scale out of India migrations, and often found lives of hardship and abuse abroad. I tell tales of women, such as Ramabai, who watched her entire family perish in a British-induced famine. She then married a Shudra man who shortly thereafter died of disease. She found widowhood as a Hindu woman very cruel and was mercilessly attacked by upper caste men of her time, including B.G. Tilak, better known for his Swaraj is my birthright statement. Eventually, Ramabai converted to Christianity, and she wrote a book called A High Caste Hindu Woman, which is compelling reading even today. Members of many other disadvantaged groups, too, made their views known, like Telugu thinkers, who authored and reused this image in the 1920s, showing Mother India holding unbalanced scales of justice over the heads of starving Dalits. Collectively, these are not pretty views of India and her cultural and religious traditions. But I honor those who lived these lives and experienced these things by narrating them straightforwardly, without sugarcoating, even when they make modern readers squirm. This brings me to my closing reflections, which really concern sort of where we are today as people in 2025 who are trying to recover and understand Indian history. And I have sort of three basic thoughts. One is that we are not post-truth. At least I am not post-truth. All right? I accept the basic criticisms of objectivity. It's really an ideal more than a reality. But history is still about real people and real events, and I don't think we should cede that ground. And so part of the power of my book and other books on South Asian history is that they offer true narratives. Historians may differ on some of the interpretive details, but our collective claim to talk about reality really matters. My second thought is that we need more, not less, from professional historians. I want to say that earlier generations have done a great job. In my classes at Rutgers Newark, I still teach Ramila Topper's Early India, which was first published in the 1960s. That book has withstood the test of time. 60 years later, it's still got legs. And what we need to do in my generation and in the next generation is to build on that amazing legacy. To me, that means producing more specialist scholarship, as well as more works aimed at a popular audience, like this book. Ultimately, we want to cultivate a greater appetite for South Asian history and a greater appreciation for understanding historical change. And this last point on historical change, this is critical. And I want to underscore here the need for professional historians to be involved. There are many popular historians out there who do a passable job, and a few who do a great job at telling good stories about the past. But overall, they tend to lack the understanding of causality, as well as the ability to do primary source research that is essential to the historian's craft. Okay, those things are not window dressing, they're the foundation. My final point is that the path forward in narrating South Asian history is long and promising. Indian history only expands over time. Literally each moment that goes by, there's more of the recorded past to know, discover, and to tell. And so our job as historians is never done. There will never be one single definitive history of India. My publishers may tell you that that is my book in order to sell it. But really, history is about continually interpreting the past, making more connections, seeing causality better, formulating an ever more nuanced story. And so my goal in writing India, it was to move the ball forward, not to stop its momentum. I very much look forward to seeing the book's reception in the coming months and years, and I look forward to your questions and comments now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for such a wonderful talk. Especially what I like most is your emphasis on the professional historian. Now the floor is open for questions. We'll take few questions, and you can send the questions through the chat box. I'll be able to. But before reaching to the audience, I have few questions to ask, if I may.
Please.
Yeah. So, ma'am, you talked about diverse evidences. So, in the 21st century, when we see that the technology is becoming advanced, so we have more archaeological sources and more archaeological research being done. So, and also we have more, like some says, we have different sources, like different diaries are coming out, and the private collections are coming out. So, how do we deal with it? Because this leads to the growth of the WhatsApp University as well, the multiplicity or the wide the sources. How we differentiate with it?
So it's a great question. I mean, I think as a starting point, we're always open to changing our narratives, right, on the basis of new evidence. I do think in the popular sphere, we see this all the time, right? Like there's like one little thing that comes out that's new and people seize upon it as like this overturns all prior evidence. That's not how it works. We all know that, right? You have to like put all of it together and come up with a coherent story. I will say there were points in the book where I actually didn't take a stand because I felt like the evidence was conflicting. I will give the example here of the Brahmi script and who invented it, right? So Mauryan historians are still on the Ashoka and his chancellery invented that script boat, okay? And they have some good evidence for that. But archaeologists they cite these sort of the Tamil Brahmi pottery shards in the deep south, and they say no, this came from the south. All right, I think both narratives are sort of half baked, right? Like the archaeologists have no clear like way that this got all the way up north. So they don't have an explanation for that. And then the Mauryan folks, they don't have an explanation for how this stuff is appearing in the south. And so on that, I just as a non-specialist in that particular subject, I did not take a stand, right? And I have a footnote on this. So if you want to know where all like the why did she tell it this way stuff is in the book, look at the end notes, okay? That's all in the notes. So I mean, I think that's one thing Two other things I'll say briefly. One is that, we are in an unfortunate moment of politicization of South Asian history, right? Who exactly is doing the archaeological work does matter. We've seen a lot of shoddy archaeological work, and that's really unfortunate, right? When sometimes it's too compromised to use, all right? And when that happens, that is what it is. We don't use bad or compromised evidence. The last thing I'll say is that sometimes connecting archaeology to what else we know from textual sources is basically impossible. I'll give the example here of early Vedic society. We have archaeological evidence of groups of people that lived in the same time and roughly the same places as early Vedic society was at. But we have no way of connecting that archaeological evidence with the Vedic peoples, and we know that there were plenty of non-Vedic peoples around as well. All right. And so again, you need more than just, oh, it seems roughly the same time and place. We'll just say these folks were Vedic. That's not how this works, right? History is a positivist discipline. So I love new evidence. I love when it comes out. I look forward to when parts of my book and how I told the story of South Asian history are actually disproved by new evidence. And then I'll change that in the next edition. But it is slow and laborious work.
So, ma'am, my next question is that recently you would have witnessed that there is a debate between India and I think in the world as well, that the how do the differentiation between these public history and the academic history, and the William Dalrymple has posed a challenge, or he had twisted that the Marxists are responsible for for their writings, that their writings are not reaching to the public. So how is this book going to help, to breach that wall? Because an academician is writing, and this is not going to be a story, as the lead fest historians do. They just leaves around and they just put it in narration. So how this book is going to help to breach the gap of academia and the public history?
Sure. So I will begin by saying that William Dalrymple is 100% wrong on this point. Okay, his comments and his sort of digging his heels in with criticizing professional historians is an incredibly bad look. It reflects very poorly on him. Anyways, I have the utmost respect for William Dalrymple as a popular historian. I think he's done a lot to increase the appetite for history among folks. And I think it's a big world, and there's plenty of room for both popular and professional historians, right? I think that if we respect him, he should give us a little bit more respect too, especially since he cannibalizes a lot of our works. Okay, with appropriate citation, nothing wrong with it, but he does rely on folks like us. That said, how does my work bridge the gap? So I am a pretty strong believer that one can write for both a popular and an academic audience, right? I'm not saying you don't sacrifice something for one or the other, all right? But I mean, my Aurangzeb book, my second book, was pretty well received. Well, I don't know if it was well received in the popular sphere, but it was received in the popular sphere and was well received in the academic sphere. I think this book, I mean, it's pretty dense. I don't know that, I mean, well, let me say, I didn't exactly write it for other folks like me. Sorry, I think it blipped there. I didn't write it for other folks like me, right? So for other full professors of South Asian history, I don't know that this is going to be like the most amazing, mind-blowing thing you've ever read. But I think certainly for students, undergraduate and graduate students, I think there's a lot there. And I certainly hope that my colleagues find it useful to teach. Practically speaking, one thing that I do is I take a lot of the scholarly apparatus and I put it elsewhere in the book, not in the main narrative. Okay? So it's all there. Like if you want my historiographical thoughts, I have pages and pages of endnotes for you. I have a whole historiography essay at the end for you. That stuff's all there. The bibliography is, I think, 60 pages, roughly. Right? Over 2,000 sources in the end, I think I ended up citing. So it's there, but that's a little different than it, sort of having the half of my introduction be about historiography, which is a standard thing in an academic monograph, right? So shifting stuff around can go a long way. I do try to write in a very accessible style. My readers will be the judge of whether I succeeded. My view is that sometimes, not always, but sometimes scholars hide behind big fancy words. Okay, and I don't see any need to do that. I think that I can communicate my ideas in relatively clear prose. We'll see what you all think.
So, ma'am, our one of the audience wants you to highlight on the northeastern aspect that you said that you have included in your book.
Oh, yeah, maybe I shouldn't have said that. I don't know that I do a great job. So, my attempt to have more regional representation in the book from different parts of the subcontinent and beyond is not fully complete, right? Like, I'm very conscious. I think I say this in the introduction that I think I've like moved the ball forward on this, but we are not there yet. I didn't correct for it entirely. I do bring in the Northeast relatively early when I talk about Tantra. Okay, and writing about Tantra is a whole nother issue because, talk about evidence that's all over the map on the origins of Tantra and who was doing it and why and how we even define Tantra. Like that was a hard thing to write. And so rather than do it in the general, which you just can't be general about Tantra, it's too specific, I give examples from Assam, from the Brahmaputra Valley and from a particular temple there, the Kamakhya temple there. Which sort of revolves around the menstruation cycle of the goddess and all of this. And I talk about what Tantra looks like in that context, right? So that's one early example where it comes up. I also talk about it a bit more later in the book, but I think that's more normal to talk about the Northeast in, the 20th century.
And one question is regarding the Ashoka statement of forest. So the audience wants to know that how did the Ashoka's Ashoka exempted from that the exempted tribal people from the punishment and all things that if they won't be followed, the rules won't be there to the tribal people. So how did this notion traveled or how this notion transitioned from Guptas to Mughals? If you could elaborate on it.
Sorry, say that one more time.
So Ashoka's forest policy, the forest people were exempted. So how was this transition happening from Gupta to Mughals and to the British era? Because in the British time, we could see that the forests were, reserved, and they were exempted from using the resources of forest.
Right. Okay, so I'm not suggesting, and I'm sorry if I didn't put this well in this talk, I'm not suggesting that it's like a direct line from Ashoka on forward. Rather, one thing that I do try to do, and I do it with a bunch of different groups and topics, is sort of kind of drop in on where they come up at different points in South Asian history. I'm not giving you the full thread because that would be a history of the tribal people. Okay, that's too narrow for this. But I do want to sort of bring them up at multiple points where possible, not just mention them once, right? And in general, there tends to be a clash between any sort of urbanizing society, right, where more people are moving to cities versus people living in the forest. That is a recurrent theme throughout South Asian history. And so we see it in Ashoka, right, who's building some big cities. He wants to centralize power, so on and so forth. Then we see it in a very different way, right, with the Guptas, who they do some kind of limited forest clearing stuff, okay, which includes clearing people out of the forest. The Mughals do something similar. And then I bring this up in the late 20th century with, I believe it's Indira Gandhi's government, who has a clash in Odisha with some of the forest folks there, right? So again, I'm not suggesting that everyone in India is anti-forest people. There's always this conflict, right? But there is this persistent or recurrent, I should say, recurrent question of what do we do when we are an urbanizing group of people and there is this other group of people that are sparsely occupying land that we want for other purposes, right? The state answer is usually violence.
The next and the last question of the session is the story behind the cover image of the book.
Oh gosh. So, okay, the cover image. Okay, so for those of you who have not published a book yet, you do the cover last. All right, so that's like the last thing. The way this usually works, you can suggest cover images as an author. I'm really a textual person, so I didn't have any images, but I did have a long list of things that we could not have on the cover. Okay, I did not want any religious imagery specific to any religion. That takes out a huge amount of pre-modern materials. I did want something pre-modern, not entirely modern. I did not want a book where women's faces were covered. You would be surprised how often that appears on books about India or South Asia. Start looking at the bookstores. A lot of like not showing women's faces. I don't know what's up with that. No saffron, no saffron dominant, no green dominant, so no like religiously coded colors, no cows. I had this huge list, okay? And so we ended up with a somewhat limited amount of options to work with. I didn't want a Mughal image, and I know I'm a Mughal historian, but so many books have had that. This is not a Mughal image, right? It's in that sort of general style, but it's a bit later. It's from about 1750 to 1800. I liked it. It has a woman. I would have preferred if it was all women. I'm not going to lie, but we couldn't find that image. All right. Sorry, gentlemen, we like you too. All right. But anyways, at least it had one woman in it. And it had a bunch of people who look different from each other, right? Different facial features, different skin tones. And so it's a fairly straightforward way to demonstrate the diversity of India, South Asia, and the histories thereof. So that's where the image came from.
So thank you very much, ma'am, for your time and really grateful talk. And we would happy to read the book and will send the reviews and comments. Thank you.
Well, wonderful. Thank you, everyone.